Welcome to the debate. When we talk about establishing the truth in a court of law, everything relies on the chain of custody, right?
Right. It's foundational.
Exactly. You find a piece of evidence at a scene, you bag it, tag it, and you log every single hand it passes through until it reaches the courtroom.
Yeah, and if there is a break in that chain, the evidence is inadmissible.
It gets thrown out. It is a rigorous, purely mechanical process designed to eliminate doubt.
The chain of custody is absolute. I mean, it is forensic. There is virtually no room for, creative interpretation because the stakes are just simply too high.
Right, but then we look at the world of professional advising, specifically how we capture and communicate a person's career value to the labor market. And suddenly, people want to act like we're painting an impressionist portrait.
An impressionist portrait?
Yeah. They want to blur the lines, blend the colors, and sort of prioritize how the final image feels rather than where the paint actually came from. So today, we are looking at the final evaluation phase of the LPR Academy, Module 10, the Capstone Audit and Certification Defense. Specifically, we are dissecting its most unyielding doctrine, which is source-to-surface traceability.
Which is a hefty topic.
It really is. I will be arguing that strict source-to-surface traceability is the indispensable safeguard for professional truth, AI governance, and privacy, while you, I believe, will be contending that an overly rigid, linear enforcement of this rule risks reducing complex market translation into a mechanical matching exercise.
That is exactly the tension we are talking about. Human careers here, right? Insisting on a forensic chain of custody for every single word a professional uses to describe themselves. It might sound great in a sterile laboratory, but in the real world of career transitions, I'd argue it restricts the holistic synthesis required for a candidate to actually be competitive.
Well, let's establish what the text demands here first, because it is unambiguous. Clip 4 spells it out. Source-to-surface traceability means every rendering can be traced back to the record.
Every single one?
Every single one. A resume bullet, a LinkedIn paragraph, an interview answer, a portfolio summary, or even a referral message. It all must connect to evidence, context, claim status, privacy boundary, and record entry. If a rendering cannot be traced, it is not Capstone Medi. The surface is not the source. The surface must answer to the source.
I understand the doctrine, but I come at it from a different way.
Let me just finish the thought on why this is mandated, though. Because without this unbroken chain, a rendering is merely fiction. It's unsupported marketing. And because this capstone now makes the use of artificial intelligence mandatory, traceability is our only empirical defense against AI hallucination.
I mean, I definitely see the risk there with AI.
Right, it's huge. Traceability is the literal proof that a candidate is practicing actual advisor judgment rather than just, hitting generate on an LLM. I see why you think that this strictness might stifle a candidate, but let me give you a different perspective. Structure is what enables true, defensible creativity because it grounds it in reality.
And I completely support accountability. I really do. A rendering without any tether to reality is just marketing fiction, as you said. But the strict automated enforcement of a literal traceability table risks contradicting the primary rule of the capstone itself.
Which rule?
The text states repeatedly, certification is not worksheet completion. Certification is demonstrated advisor judgment.
True.
Higher-level advisor judgment requires a synthesis of value patterns. You have to look at a whole person. And those patterns do not always map cleanly in a, one-to-one linear traceback to a single piece of evidence.
Okay, but how does prioritizing compliance destroy nuance?
Because candidates will choose easily traced generic statements just to pass the automated discrepancy report. They're going to sacrifice the highly nuanced market translation that complex career transitions actually demand. They'll write for the machine.
Well, to understand why that linear mapping is necessary, let's look at the mechanics of translating a past record for a new market. Tool 3.5c, the market translation brief, explicitly requires the candidate to answer a critical question before they even start writing.
Why the lane is credible enough to test?
Exactly. Why is this new target role, this market lane, credible enough to test? Traceability is precisely what provides that credibility.
Okay, let's ground this. Let's invent a candidate so we aren't just talking in, like, abstractions here.
Sure, go ahead.
Imagine a military logistics officer. Let's say she spent 10 years managing supply chains in conflict zones. Now she is transitioning to the civilian sector, and she wants to target a role as a director of supply chain for a major civilian tech company.
Ah, so in the language of the method, this is a bridge-required lane.
Exactly. She has never held that exact civilian title before. It's bridge required.
Perfect example. A bridge-required lane inherently means she is targeting a role she hasn't held. If you do not have strict traceability connecting her new civilian-facing resume bullets back to the specific context entries of her military service, tool to be stuff, the budget she managed, the constraints she overcame, her rendering becomes a false promise.
A false promise?
Yes, if you aren't explicitly identifying where her experience doesn't perfectly match a civilian world, you're just building a bridge out of thin air. Traceability forces her advisor to show exactly which stones from the past are being used to pave the path forward.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Enforcing absolute forensic tracing for every single rendering fragments the very value she brings. When you translate her complex military career into civilian tech language, it is much like translating a poem from one language to another.
Okay, come on. A resume is not a poem.
Just bear with me. The mechanics of translation are the same. If you translate a poem by tracing every single word strictly back to its literal source dictionary definition in the original language, what happens?
It becomes literal.
You end up with a clunky, robotic, unreadable sentence. You lose the holistic meaning, the cadence, and the overall impact of the poem in the new language.
But if a translation loses its literal meaning in professional advising, you're lying to the labor market. The capstone evaluates whether an advisor can protect professional truth. We aren't here to make art, we are here to make claims.
No, you are missing the synthesis. Our military officer didn't just move boxes. She demonstrated a high-level value pattern of crisis leadership across 5 different deployments.
Right, which Tool 3B covers.
Exactly. If the advisor spots that overarching pattern of leadership, but the strict traceability table forces them to map a single synthesized rendering line on our LinkedIn back to individual micro-level evidence entries, like a specific manifest from a specific Tuesday in 2018, you lose the forest for the trees. Complex career transitions require holistic translation, not just a forensic accounting of past evidence.
The poem analogy breaks down, though, because professional claims carry stakes. If you claim a pattern of leadership on a resume, you must trace it to specific decisions, witnesses, or outcomes. Otherwise, literally anyone can claim a pattern of leadership.
But the context...
The method itself has a mechanism for this. The advisor isn't just looking at the raw evidence. They are using context reconstruction. They map out the before condition, the after condition, the constraints of that military deployment.
Exactly. The context changes the meaning of the evidence. When a candidate synthesizes all of that into an adjacent fit market lane for civilian tech, the resulting rendering is a composite. It's a higher-order truth.
A higher-order truth?
Yes! And forcing a linear one-to-one traceability table onto a composite truth is what reduces human advisor judgment back down to mere worksheet completion.
Look, if human judgment were the only factor here, I might concede that a looser interpretation could work. I really might. But human synthesis is no longer the only factor. This translation process is now heavily mediated by technology. The capstone mandates the use of AI to generate these renderings, and traceability is the only mechanism we have to govern this mandatory AI use.
Well, AI governance is certainly the most volatile element of this whole framework. I'll give you that.
Because the stakes are completely different now. Candidates must use AI, but they must govern it. They feed the AI a source-bound prompt, meaning they constrain the LLM strictly to the provided safe source packet. Then they have to perform an AI output claim check.
Which is tedious but necessary.
Extremely necessary. The standard is exact. AI output must answer to the record. What happens when the AI generates a bullet for our military officer that sounds incredibly polished, but claims she managed a software implementation she only vaguely interacted with?
You reject it.
Exactly. The traceability table is the mechanism that forces the candidate to reject or manually revise that inflated output. They log it in the rejected AI claims log. Without strict source-to-surface mapping, the AI's polished hallucination simply becomes the new surface.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the inherent automation paradox in how the Academy enforces this?
Paradox? How so?
I entirely agree on the necessity of rejecting AI hallucinations. But look at the enforcement mechanism. After a candidate submits their package, it goes through the record automated benchmark.
Right, the certification-ready gate.
Yeah. It runs a discrepancy report comparing the candidate's renderings against the system's automated processing. It uses semantic matching to see if the rendering strays too far from the source text. If the machine flags a traceability discrepancy, the candidate cannot pass the gate.
Correct.
So doesn't this functionally make the AI the certifier of traceability?
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. The doctrine explicitly states, the benchmark is not the certifier. The human assessor is the certifier.
But functionally, the automated benchmark acts as a hard stop. The candidate has to self-remediate until they pass those automated gates. If you can't reach the human assessor for review until the algorithm is satisfied with your traceability, then the machine's definition of traceability is the one that governs the candidate's fate.
Okay, but
It creates a perverse incentive.
what incentive?
Writing for the machine instead of the market. The candidate will look at their nuanced, beautifully translated brief for the military officer, a composite rendering that perfectly captures her crisis leadership for a civilian tech audience, and they will realize the automated engine might flag it as a discrepancy.
Because it lacks a literal match.
Exactly, because it doesn't see a literal one-to-one keyword match. So they intentionally dumb it down, they make it clunky and literal just to get past the gate. They are negotiating with an algorithm about the philosophical nature of their translation before a human ever even sees it.
You are completely mischaracterizing the purpose of the gate. The benchmark is a readiness gate, not the final human review. It exists to protect the human assessor's time from incomplete worksheet dumps and, frankly, obvious safety failures.
But it flags nuance as failure.
For unsupported claims that clearly violate the source-bound prompt, it is verifying the presence of the traceability architecture itself, ensuring that the AI output claim check actually occurred.
Right, but
The human assessor still makes the final call on whether the synthesis was sound, but the machine ensures the candidate isn't handing the assessor an ungoverned, AI-generated fiction.
But if the machine flags an overstated claim based on its own automated semantic processing, the candidate is stuck in a remediation loop. That is the danger of marrying strict traceability to automated gates. It forces the advisor to act like a data entry clerk rather than a strategic translator.
It is a necessary friction. We cannot trust humans to manually catch every single subtle hallucination an LLM introduces when generating, 20 pages of market materials. The automated gate forces the advisor to stop, look at the literal text, and prove the connection.
I just feel like it's heavy-handed.
Well, that friction becomes a matter of professional survival when we move from AI governance into the ethical stakes of the data itself, specifically the human subject behind the record. This brings us to privacy.
Well, privacy is paramount. I won't argue there. The text is clear. Proof is not permission.
Precisely. The doctrine mandates that every privacy boundary must travel with the claim. Traceability isn't just about truth, it's about protection. If a rendering isn't mathematically traced back to the privacy and exclusion log, restricted evidence is going to slip into public view.
Which is a nightmare.
Or worse, the advisor might unsafely upload confidential data into an external LLM prompt. The curriculum notes that exposing third-party info or confidential employer files is an automatic red flag. If an advisor can't trace exactly where a piece of information came from, they have no way of knowing what privacy label is attached to it.
I am in full agreement on the principle, absolutely. But this is exactly where the strictness of the traceability table breaks down conceptually.
How?
Let's bring back our military officer. What happens when her most impressive logistical triumph, the one that really proves she is ready for a director of supply chain role, was a highly classified deployment?
Well, the curriculum explicitly instructs candidates to use metadata only or safe summary entries to protect confidential material.
Yes, a safe summary.
But if I am a listener hearing this, I'm probably wondering how you can trace something that is explicitly hidden. How does a metadata-only trace actually work in practice without completely destroying the value of the resume?
Okay, so a metadata-only trace abstracts the sensitive details while preserving the scale and scope. Instead of naming the classified base and the exact munitions moved, the entry might read, managed a Q3 overseas logistics operation, oversaw a budget exceeding $50 million, and a cross-functional team of 200 personnel. You trace the rendering back to that abstracted entry.
But how do you maintain a rigorous source-to-surface trace when the source is literally hidden by design? If a candidate uses those safe summaries, their final rendering on the resume is naturally going to be abstracted. It has to be, to protect the subject.
Right.
Doesn't strict traceability of these safe summaries inevitably lead to the scenario where the AI output looks polished but is functionally generic?
Not if the advisor does their job.
Think about it from the hiring manager's perspective, though. If I trace a bullet point to a box that just says confidential overseas project data, the traceability table is satisfied structurally. The automated gate gives it a green light, but the rendering itself lacks the very evidence-backed punch that the LPR method is supposed to deliver. It reads like every other generic management resume out there. Managed a large team, handled a big budget. It strips all the texture and grit out of her career.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are assuming that an abstracted trace is a failed trace.
It's a weak trace.
It is not. An explicitly logged proof gap or a metadata-only trace is a valid trace in this methodology. It demonstrates exact advisor judgment.
But does it render well for the market? If the rendering is generic, it isn't credible in a highly competitive tech job market. That is the tension.
Knowing what can and cannot be safely rendered and still effectively communicating value is the very definition of professional competence. If the evidence is restricted, the advisor must lean on context reconstruction, the constraints, the environment, the scope of responsibility, rather than exposing the raw classified data.
But the system punishes them for that.
No, the traceability ensures that the advisor consciously made that trade-off. When the human assessor reviews the capstone defense scenario, they are going to ask a very specific question. The strongest evidence is confidential. How do you render it safely?
And my argument is that the strictness of the tracing mechanism penalizes the candidate for trying to answer that question creatively. When the candidate is sitting there trying to satisfy the automated benchmark, the pressure of proving strict traceability on hidden evidence pushes them toward creating inherently weaker market translation. It forces the advisor to act like a censor rather than a translator.
Being a censor of unsafe material is a fundamental duty of the advisor. If protecting a client's confidential data makes a resume bullet slightly more generic, that is a trade-off the method gladly accepts.
It just feels so restrictive.
The traceability table proves the candidate didn't just invent a metric to replace the confidential one. It proves they applied the privacy boundary consistently from the initial log all the way to the final rendering.
You are asking candidates to perfectly thread a needle while wearing the algorithmic blindfold of the automated benchmark.
I would argue the benchmark is a guardrail, not a blindfold. It keeps you on the road. Let's summarize where we stand, as this tension clearly strikes at the heart of the capstone audit.
Sure.
My position remains that strict source-to-surface traceability is the ultimate, non-negotiable mechanism to ensure truth. It governs the mandatory AI requirement by forcing outputs to answer strictly to the record, and it protects privacy by ensuring restrictions travel with the claim. Without it, we cannot separate true advisor judgment from mere aesthetic polish.
And my position is that while the conceptual accountability of traceability is entirely necessary, the rigid, automated enforcement of it risks stifling the holistic synthesis required for complex market translation. It forces a mechanical, literal mapping that can obscure higher-level value patterns, especially when dealing with bridge-required lanes and restricted evidence.
Right.
Our military logistics officer deserves to have her full pattern of leadership translated, not just her unclassified data points audited by a semantic matching engine.
Well, we do certainly find common ground on the fundamental doctrine itself. We both agree on the core rule from Clip 4. The the surface is not the source. And we agree that AI must be strictly governed rather than treated as an unchecked authority on professional truth.
Absolutely. AI cannot become the source of truth, and a rendering without any tether to reality is just marketing fiction. Our disagreement is purely on how tightly you pull that tether before it strangles the translation.
Which means this tension between forensic evidence tracing and creative market translation remains the ultimate ongoing test of an advisor's judgment. For those listening, this is exactly why this module is the final evaluation gate. I highly suggest looking deeper into the source material to explore how the LPR methodology attempts to balance the protection of professional truth with making it genuinely usable and renderable for the market.
It is not a tension that can be solved with a simple worksheet. It requires constant active navigation between the literal truth and the holistic truth.
Indeed, we started this discussion by comparing the forensic chain of custody to painting an impressionist portrait. Perhaps the true art of the certified advisor is realizing that you can only paint a masterpiece if you know exactly where every single drop of your paint was manufactured. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.